Before we dive into today's tale, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss another story from the Afterlight History. Also, we want to know where and when you're watching this video. Leave it in the comments below. Is it a quiet night or a busy morning? Let us know and become part of the story. Now, step carefully and join us as we journey into the terrifying streets of Strasbourg in 1518, where the city itself seemed to dance without mercy. The city of Strasbourg, in that summer of 1518, was unlike any other place at that moment. Its cobblestone streets, usually vibrant with the trade of merchants and the chatter of children, had become an arena of silent horror. Windows were shuttered, doors bolted. But even behind walls, the echoes of footsteps, so many footsteps, filled the air, bouncing from one stone facade to the next, leaving no sense of distance, no sense of normal rhythm. People whispered about them, spoke of them in hushed tones, as if saying them aloud might summon the movement to them too. Mothers pulled their children close, and yet, even in the dark corners of homes, some of the children were restless, dancing in dreams, jerking, trembling, and occasionally rising from bed with wild eyes to move, as though compelled by some invisible hand. The town's doctors were exhausted. They walked the streets from dawn to dusk, moving among the dancers as if guiding them could bring relief. They offered bread, wine, and water. They pressed their hands upon the foreheads of the afflicted. They shook their heads, whispered prayers, and sometimes, quietly, wept. Each day brought more dancers. A woman who had begun alone on the steps of her home became a crowd of dozens, and then hundreds. Fathers joined their daughters, sons their mothers, servants their masters. There was no force, no orders. None could resist. Those who tried to stand still found themselves moving anyway. Chairs tipped over, tables were abandoned mid-meal. Street vendors abandoned goods and ran, or danced, in long lines behind their fellow citizens, their eyes glazed, their hands limp, but their legs unyielding. The rhythm of movement seemed almost deliberate, as though the city itself were orchestrating the motion. Priests and clergy tried to intervene, chanting hymns, sprinkling holy water, striking bells, begging God to release his wrath and spare his people. But the dancers did not pause. Some fell at the feet of the priests, crying, their bodies racked with exhaustion, their hearts racing against their will. Others rose immediately after, continuing as though the human body had become a marionette for some unseen puppeteer. Entire squares filled with people who could no longer command their own limbs. Some screamed, some laughed hysterically. Some cried quietly to themselves, their lips moving as though muttering prayers that were unheard by anyone else. And yet, through it all, the city itself remained eerily calm. The wind blew gently. Windows rattled softly. The sun shone, setting in a way that seemed normal, and yet there was a strange luminescence in the air, a weight of expectation that pressed upon everyone, dancer and observer alike. Families tore themselves apart in desperation. Fathers grabbed children, mothers clutched their husbands, servants held onto masters, all trying to prevent them from stepping into the street. But no restraint could succeed. It was as though the dancers were being pulled by threads that ran beneath the cobblestones, threads invisible to the human eye but tangible to the body. Feet moved. Hands gestured. Bodies leaned and spun, as though some inner mechanism had overridden conscious thought. The city watched in terror as it transformed, not into chaos, but into a slow, deliberate, unstoppable tide of motion. And there was something terrifyingly organized about it, as though every person were part of a greater design. Each step counted, each movement necessary, even if no one understood why. By the second week, the mortality rate had begun to climb. Weak bodies fell mid-stride, arms collapsed, legs buckled. Some toppled into fountains or against carts, never to rise again. The streets became littered with the casualties of endurance, the living and the dying moving in the same relentless rhythm, while those who tried to intervene were forced to step around them, powerless. The city itself seemed to mourn, but in a way incomprehensible to the human mind. The bells rang, but not for funerals. The priests prayed, but their words seemed swallowed by the air. Merchants closed shops, but their goods were abandoned in piles as people stepped over them without notice. The city became a stage for something incomprehensible, a place where human will had been suspended, where the body betrayed the mind and moved according to rules unseen. Outside Strasbourg, word spread. Travelers and neighboring townsfolk whispered of a dancing sickness. Fear grew, but it was a distant fear at first, until some who fled returned with symptoms of their own. Families began to panic. They barricaded themselves. They avoided food and drink from the city. Some carried herbs, others charms, others relics they believed might protect them. Yet those who were drawn to Strasbourg often found themselves unable to resist. They arrived with intentions of safety, only to find themselves stepping into the streets, compelled, moving before they realized it. Stories emerged of people watching friends and family dance in the square, unable to stop, powerless, while silently pleading for release that never came. Hospitals were overwhelmed. Physicians experimented with methods both crude and desperate. They burned herbs, they played instruments, they restrained bodies. They tried to massage muscles, to force rest. But nothing worked. Some claimed the dancing began to synchronize with the sound of drums, a rhythm that pulsed almost independently from any human music. The dancers seemed to move in waves, the energy passing from person to person, growing with intensity. Observations suggested a contagion, but a contagion unlike any known disease. There was no fever at first, no rash, no cough, only the compulsion to move, to step, to twist, to spin, to continue endlessly. Priests began to fear not just for the souls of the dancers, but for the souls of the observers. They wondered if the city itself had been cursed, or if God's judgment had manifested physically in a way humans could not understand. Folklore was consulted. Ancient rites were enacted, sacred water sprinkled, holy banners waved. Bells tolled in succession to call the dancers back to reason. Occasionally, someone fell to their knees, weeping, praying for mercy, and yet, once they rose, their feet moved again, as though some inner mechanism had been reset. By the third week, authorities realized that traditional measures were insufficient. They cleared halls for public dancing, believing that channeling the movement in structured spaces might save lives. They hired musicians, drummers, and pipers to lead the dancers through controlled routines. Entire buildings were cleared to accommodate them. The city became a theater, but the more organized the movement, the more dancers appeared. It was as though attempting to control it only amplified the phenomenon. Mortality continued. Exhaustion and injury claimed bodies in the street even as new dancers joined the procession. The city teetered between life and death, order and chaos, and still, the music played and the people moved. By the fourth week, Strasbourg had changed in ways that could not be reversed. Streets once filled with market stalls now bore only the echoes of footfalls and the occasional sob of someone who had stumbled, someone who had collapsed, but then risen again. Those who had barricaded themselves inside homes became increasingly desperate. Windows were nailed shut. Families whispered in corners, clutching rosaries and relics, muttering prayers and chants in low voices, convinced that to speak too loudly would summon the compulsion to them. Mothers told their children that dancing was the work of the devil, and fathers recounted old legends of spirits that could seize the living and make them puppets in a cruel performance. But even inside the thickest walls, even behind closed doors, some could hear the rhythmic pounding of feet, the unnatural harmony of hundreds of bodies moving without pause, like a heartbeat imposed on the city itself. Doctors, still overwhelmed, experimented further, their minds fraying from exhaustion and despair. They observed patterns that seemed to defy logic. Some dancers moved more intensely when music played, yet even in silence, their limbs could not remain still. The compulsion seemed embedded in the body, a force beyond reason. They noted the physical toll: swollen feet, bleeding soles, strained joints, broken bones. And yet, despite the pain, despite exhaustion, people continued. It was as if the human will had been replaced by something else, some inexorable drive that prioritized movement above survival, movement above reason, movement above life itself. Scholars later theorized about ergot poisoning in rye bread, a hallucinogenic fungus that can cause convulsions, but even that failed to explain the synchronization, the endurance, the way the phenomenon seemed to spread socially as much as physiologically. Priests, desperate for intervention, turned to extreme measures. Processions of clergy marched through the streets, chanting, sprinkling holy water, ringing bells, and reciting prayers in Latin, German, and the tongues of long-forgotten saints. They carried crosses, holy relics, and sacred texts. Occasionally a dancer would fall before them, sobbing, shaking, begging for mercy. But as soon as they were left alone, their feet resumed moving, driven by forces no human hand could control. Some clergy began to despair openly, retreating to churches and chapels to pray for divine intervention. Others, braver, or perhaps more desperate, attempted to restrain dancers, tying their hands and feet with rope or cloth. Many of these interventions failed. The dancers often rose again, their bodies writhing violently, forcing themselves free, as though every fiber of their being sought release in motion. Stories began to emerge of those who resisted for days, who fought the compulsion in vain. They experienced hallucinations, extreme exhaustion, and mental breakdowns. One chronicler later wrote that the body moves while the soul watches, powerless, a prisoner in its own flesh. Some individuals attempted to flee Strasbourg entirely, hoping that crossing the city limits would free them. Those who made it beyond the gates often returned after days, inexplicably drawn back, as if invisible threads tied them to the place, pulling them into movement. Merchants abandoned carts full of goods. Soldiers left their posts. Nobles deserted their estates. The city became a place where human social hierarchies and authority ceased to matter, where only the irresistible compulsion ruled. By the fifth week, the mortality rate had become catastrophic. Dancers collapsed mid-step and did not rise. Some fell into fountains or streams, swept away by their own exhaustion. Others died on street corners, their hands clutching nothing, their eyes wide open in the last moments of involuntary awareness. The living continued to dance around them, stepping over their bodies, unable to stop. The city council, desperate to restore order, attempted to enforce curfews, tried to isolate the dancers, and sought counsel from physicians in distant towns. But all measures failed. The compulsion spread, amplified by fear and observation, infecting those who watched as much as those who moved. By the sixth week, the streets of Strasbourg were filled with dozens, then hundreds, then perhaps thousands of people who could no longer control their own bodies. As the weeks turned into the second month, Strasbourg became a city both living and dead. Streets were no longer streets but paths of endless motion, worn smooth by the constant stepping of hundreds, then thousands, of bodies that moved without pause. Entire families had been lost, their absence noted only when chairs remained empty at dinner tables, beds unmade, and hearth fires left to burn themselves out. The city's leaders were desperate, resorting to methods that now seem surreal. They tried isolation, they tried public punishments, hoping to break the compulsion through fear. They even experimented with forced relocation of dancers to neighboring villages, thinking that removing them from the urban environment would stop the madness. Each attempt failed. People did not resist the movement. They were drawn to it, as though the very earth beneath Strasbourg had pulled them into a dance beyond reason. Those who had once resisted often succumbed first, their bodies betraying their minds in the cruelest demonstration of inevitability. Daily life outside the dancing squares became impossible. Merchants abandoned trade entirely. Food rotted on counters. Livestock wandered freely through streets littered with the remnants of human life: shoes, cloaks, bowls, coins, and splintered carts. The market, once the heart of Strasbourg, became a theater of endurance, a place where the living and the dying performed a cruel ballet. Even the city's religious institutions were powerless. Churches remained open, their doors barred only by their own faith in God's mercy. Priests prayed ceaselessly, the Latin hymns echoing through empty aisles, sometimes joined by the terrified cries of parishioners forced to witness the movement of friends and relatives in endless repetition. But faith, no matter how devout, could not halt what was occurring. The dance continued, spreading like wildfire, touching every corner of the city. Medical intervention, too, became increasingly desperate. Physicians exhausted their knowledge, experimenting with potions, herbal concoctions, and bleeding rituals. They tried to cool overheated bodies, offering baths, iced compresses, and shade. Yet the dancers rejected assistance unconsciously. Their muscles moved with a persistence that ignored both injury and pain. Legs gave way, bones fractured, feet were lacerated. Yet still the body rose and continued. Doctors observed convulsions, tremors, and hallucinations, but found no explanation that could account for the scale of the phenomenon. Some hypothesized a supernatural cause, an ancient curse or divine punishment, while others clung to the possibility of ergot poisoning in rye bread. Yet ergot, while hallucinogenic, could not explain the coordinated and seemingly social spread of the dancing behavior, nor the endurance that allowed people to continue moving for days and weeks on end. The city itself became a laboratory of suffering, a place where human limits were tested beyond any natural measure. The psychological toll on those who were not dancing was profound. Parents wept in secret, children screamed in terror, and observers often fell into despair. Sleep became nearly impossible for anyone in Strasbourg. Dreams were haunted by movement, the sound of feet on cobblestones, the rhythm of unseen dancers, the sensation that one's own body might rise and step without consent. Fear became a communal disease, spreading silently through walls and closed windows, and those who resisted the pull of the dance were often paralyzed by indecision, unable to act as their neighbors moved around them like specters. Entire neighborhoods fell silent, the living retreating into homes, whispering stories of madness and death, while outside, the streets continued to pulse with a relentless rhythm. By the third month, mortality had reached catastrophic levels. The wounded, the exhausted, and those who fell to disease were left lying in the streets, trampled underfoot or avoided entirely by their still-moving neighbors. Bodies were carried away by volunteers, but the removal was slow and incomplete. The city became a landscape of motion and death intertwined. Some attempted to flee entirely, leaving Strasbourg only to return, compelled by an irresistible force, drawn back into the streets and the inexorable rhythm. Visitors from neighboring towns observed with horror, documenting the event as best they could, though few survived to tell the tale with clarity. The combination of fear, exhaustion, and sheer mystery ensured that Strasbourg's story became legendary almost immediately, a cautionary tale whispered across Europe. By the fourth month, the city's physical and social structure was collapsing. Buildings remained intact, yet they were empty of life, occupied only by the moving bodies of those compelled to dance. Shops were shuttered or destroyed, livestock roamed freely, and the streets were strewn with the detritus of abandoned life. Priests, doctors, and city officials were forced to accept the impossibility of control. Some chose to leave, fleeing to nearby villages, while others remained, documenting the ongoing events for posterity. The chroniclers wrote of unimaginable suffering, but also of strange calm in the dancers themselves, as though a higher purpose, incomprehensible to the human mind, drove their motion. Death was ever present, but not all succumbed. Some survived weeks without sleep, barely able to eat, moving as though sustained by the force that compelled them. As the weeks turned into the second month, Strasbourg became a city both living and dead. Streets were no longer streets, but paths of endless motion, worn smooth by the constant stepping of hundreds. then thousands of bodies that moved without pause. Entire families had been lost, their absence noted only when chairs remained empty at dinner tables, beds unmade, and hearth fires left to burn themselves out. The city's leaders were desperate, resorting to methods that now seem surreal. They tried isolation, they tried public punishments, hoping to break the compulsion through fear. They even experimented with forced relocation of dancers to neighboring villages, thinking that removing them from the urban environment would stop the madness. Each attempt failed. People did not resist the movement. They were drawn to it as though the very earth beneath Strasbourg had pulled them into a dance beyond reason. Those who had once resisted often succumbed first, their bodies betraying their minds in the cruelest demonstration of inevitability. Daily life outside the dancing squares became impossible. Merchants abandoned trade entirely. Food rotted on counters. Livestock wandered freely through streets littered with the remnants of human life: shoes, cloaks, bowls, coins, and splintered carts. The market, once the heart of Strasbourg, became a theater of endurance, a place where the living and the dying performed a cruel ballet. Even the city's religious institutions were powerless. Churches remained open, their doors barred only by their own faith in God's mercy. Priests prayed ceaselessly, the Latin hymns echoing through empty aisles, sometimes joined by the terrified cries of parishioners, forced to witness the movement of friends and relatives in endless repetition. But faith, no matter how devout, could not halt what was occurring. The dance continued, spreading like wildfire, touching every corner of the city. Medical intervention, too, became increasingly desperate. Physicians exhausted their knowledge, experimenting with potions, herbal concoctions, and bleeding rituals. They tried to cool overheated bodies, offering baths, iced compresses, and shade. Yet the dancers rejected assistance unconsciously. Their muscles moved with a persistence that ignored both injury and pain. Legs gave way, bones fractured, feet were lacerated, yet still the body rose and continued. Doctors observed convulsions, tremors, and hallucinations, but found no explanation that could account for the scale of the phenomenon. Some hypothesized a supernatural cause, an ancient curse or divine punishment, while others clung to the possibility of ergot poisoning in rye bread. Yet ergot, while hallucinogenic, could not explain the coordinated and seemingly social spread of the dancing behavior, nor the endurance that allowed people to continue moving for days and weeks on end. The city itself became a laboratory of suffering, a place where human limits were tested beyond any natural measure. The psychological toll on those who were not dancing was profound. Parents wept in secret, children screamed in terror, and observers often fell into despair. Sleep became nearly impossible for anyone in Strasbourg. Dreams were haunted by movement, the sound of feet on cobblestones, the rhythm of unseen dancers, the sensation that one's own body might rise and step without consent. Fear became a communal disease, spreading silently through walls and closed windows, and those who resisted the pull of the dance were often paralyzed by indecision, unable to act as their neighbors moved around them like specters. Entire neighborhoods fell silent, the living retreating into homes, whispering stories of madness and death, while outside, the streets continued to pulse with a relentless rhythm. By the third month, mortality had reached catastrophic levels. The wounded, the exhausted, and those who fell to disease were left lying in the streets, trampled underfoot, or avoided entirely by their still-moving neighbors. Bodies were carried away by volunteers, but the removal was slow and incomplete. The city became a landscape of motion and death intertwined. Some attempted to flee entirely, leaving Strasbourg only to return, compelled by an irresistible force, drawn back into the streets and the inexorable rhythm. Visitors from neighboring towns observed with horror, documenting the event as best they could, though few survived to tell the tale with clarity. The combination of fear, exhaustion, and sheer mystery ensured that Strasbourg's story became legendary almost immediately, a cautionary tale whispered across Europe. By the fourth month, the city's physical and social structure was collapsing. Buildings remained intact, yet they were empty of life, occupied only by the moving bodies of those compelled to dance. Shops were shuttered or destroyed, livestock roamed freely, and the streets were strewn with the detritus of abandoned life. Priests, doctors, and city officials were forced to accept the impossibility of control. Some chose to leave, fleeing to nearby villages, while others remained, documenting the ongoing events for posterity. The chroniclers wrote of unimaginable suffering, but also of strange calm in the dancers themselves, as though a higher purpose, incomprehensible to the human mind, drove their motion. Death was ever present, but not all succumbed. Some survived weeks without sleep, barely able to eat, moving as though sustained by the force that compelled them. By the fifth month, Strasbourg was barely recognizable as a city. What had once been orderly streets were now worn smooth by the relentless passage of feet. Entire neighborhoods had emptied of anyone able to resist the compulsion. Families were fractured beyond repair, some members trapped in the dance while others cowered indoors, too terrified to intervene. Occasionally, a dancer would fall, unable to rise, and their neighbors, still moving, would step over them, sometimes gently, sometimes not, as if their own bodies obeyed an invisible command beyond empathy. Homes were abandoned mid-meal, fires burned unattended. Livestock wandered among the dancers, seemingly unafraid, grazing on upturned dirt or abandoned crops, as if nature itself had adapted to the chaos. The city's clergy tried to impose order through religion, holding mass in empty squares, ringing bells continuously, and offering prayers for divine intervention. Yet their words seemed swallowed by the air. Some dancers fell to their knees briefly in the presence of holy water or relics, only to rise immediately and continue their movement. The priests began to whisper of demonic influence, of judgment from a wrathful God, of punishment for sins too ancient to remember. Some carried holy crosses through the streets, attempting to halt the dancers, but even these instruments of faith were powerless. The phenomenon had become larger than the human will. It had become a force that transcended reason, morality, and mortality. Physicians had grown pale and hollow-eyed from exhaustion. They had tried every known remedy: cooling baths, herbal infusions, massaging joints, dietary adjustments, and isolation chambers. None worked. Even drugs or alcohol offered no release. They noted that some dancers showed signs of hallucination or delirium, but most seemed lucid in their minds, while their bodies betrayed them. Accounts recorded that people could describe conversations, remember past events, and respond coherently to questions, yet their legs and feet moved, as though animated by a mechanical force. Some chroniclers later remarked that the human body can be split into mind and machine, and in Strasbourg that division became horrifyingly visible. Children, as in the earliest weeks, were the first to fall under the compulsion. Young ones, even when held, would rise and step forward, often dragging parents or siblings along. Parents were torn between restraint and resignation, unsure which would cause less suffering. Observers wrote that the city had become a theater of endurance, a cruel dance that blurred the lines between life and death, reality and madness. Those who resisted often experienced severe psychological breakdowns, night terrors, muteness, and even catatonia. They described feeling watched or called from within, a pressure in their chests that could not be explained. Those who were drawn to the streets sometimes claimed they felt compelled by the sound of distant footsteps or an invisible rhythm that traveled through the stones themselves. By the sixth month, mortality had reached staggering levels. People collapsed mid-step and never rose. Some were trampled. Others succumbed to exhaustion, dehydration, or injuries sustained during the constant movement. The living continued to move around them, seemingly oblivious to suffering. Chroniclers described the city as a carnival of despair, a place where bodies were both instruments and victims, moving endlessly while the mind struggled in vain. The sight was unbearable to those who survived, and even those who left Strasbourg reported nightmares for months afterward. Dreams of streets that never ended, bodies that moved without pause, and the faint, haunting echo of hundreds of feet striking stone in perfect unison. Authorities eventually abandoned attempts at direct intervention. They documented the events, buried the dead when possible, and withdrew to safer locations. Those who remained in the city became part of the phenomenon, either through exhaustion, surrender, or some inexplicable attraction to the streets. Some chroniclers attempted to trace the origin of the movement, theorizing about contagious fear, spiritual punishment, or fungal intoxication. Others posited that the human psyche itself could transmit compulsion, a collective trance born from extreme stress, deprivation, and isolation. None of these explanations satisfied anyone at the time, or would satisfy modern historians entirely. The city had become a living paradox, a place of law and chaos, life and death, observation and involuntary action. The social fabric of Strasbourg disintegrated completely. Markets closed permanently. Families vanished, leaving belongings in homes to decay. Animals, once domesticated, roamed freely. The wealthy abandoned estates. Craftsmen left workshops half-finished. Clergy maintained religious rites in empty squares. Physicians continued to observe, recording details of movement, collapse, and recovery for posterity, though their own health often failed under the strain. The city was no longer a city in the conventional sense. It was a theater of compulsion, endurance, and human fragility. The phenomenon became both a warning and a mystery, recorded in diaries, letters, and chronicles, preserved for future generations, even as its meaning remained elusive. By the 7th month, the city of Strasbourg had been hollowed out by movement, fear, and death. The streets were scarred with footprints, trampled flowers, upturned carts, and splintered furniture. Entire districts were abandoned, silent but for the occasional shuffle of those still compelled. Those who had survived the compulsion began to wander aimlessly, sometimes leaving the city, sometimes returning as if drawn by an invisible force. Food was scarce. Water was rationed. Animals roamed freely through empty squares, grazing on what remained of gardens and markets. The city council, once organized and authoritative, had little power left. Orders were meaningless when the populace no longer obeyed. Authority itself had been suspended, replaced by an unstoppable rhythm that had neither logic nor mercy. The end of the plague came not with a thunderous event, but with a slow, almost imperceptible fading. Some dancers simply stopped. Others collapsed and never rose again. Some survivors reported that the compulsion seemed to release them when the mind no longer resisted, when exhaustion had become absolute, when the body had no energy left to obey. Accounts from physicians and clergy suggest that the last days were the quietest, yet perhaps the most terrifying. The streets were littered with the bodies of the fallen, the living barely capable of moving, their faces pale and hollow, eyes haunted by weeks of relentless motion. The city was left in ruins. Buildings remained standing, but interiors were abandoned. Markets were empty. Inns were vacated. Churches bore silent witness to the horror that had passed. Families who had survived had often lost multiple members, their homes left incomplete, their belongings scattered and decayed. The social structure of Strasbourg had been shattered. Merchants were bankrupt. Artisans had abandoned their craft. Nobles had fled, leaving estates unattended. The city that had once thrived on commerce, craft, and trade now seemed frozen in a tableau of suffering and endurance. Survivors were haunted long after the physical compulsion had ended. Children who had danced involuntarily were often withdrawn, their nights filled with nightmares of movement, rhythm, and endless streets. Adults suffered from psychological trauma, tremors, anxiety, insomnia, and panic at the sound of feet on stone. Religious authorities reported that some survivors turned to extreme piety, convinced that divine punishment had been narrowly avoided. Others rejected faith entirely, unable to reconcile what had occurred with any doctrine or explanation. Chroniclers documented these accounts meticulously, preserving letters, diaries, and official records. not knowing that they were leaving a window into one of the strangest episodes of human history. Medical practitioners debated explanations for centuries. Ergotism, the poisoning caused by a fungus in rye bread, remained a leading theory, and indeed, some evidence suggested that many had consumed contaminated food. Yet ergot alone could not explain the collective nature of the movement, the synchronization, or the duration. Scholars speculated about mass hysteria, social contagion, and psychological breakdown under extreme stress, famine, and fear. Even today, the phenomenon is studied as a complex interplay of biology, psychology, and social dynamics. Strasbourg, for its part, slowly recovered. Streets were cleaned, markets reopened. New families moved in. Yet the memory of the dancing plague never faded. Buildings where the first movements had begun were left unaltered as a reminder. Accounts were passed down through generations, stories whispered to children, and chroniclers ensured that the city would never forget. It became a cautionary tale of how fragile human control can be, how easily the body can betray the mind, and how quickly social order can dissolve under unseen pressures. The plague also left a lingering question. How much of human will is truly free? How much is subject to forces beyond perception, beyond comprehension? Survivors often spoke of a compulsion that felt older than history itself, older than the city, older even than the generations of men and women who had lived there. It was not merely a disease or a psychological anomaly. It was a force that demonstrated the limits of human endurance, the fragility of the mind, and the persistence of the body, even when reason fails. Years later, scientists, historians, and psychologists would analyze the records, trying to piece together what had happened. They studied weather patterns, the availability of food, reports of other mass hysteria events in Europe, and documented medical symptoms. They could not find a single explanation. Some proposed that the dancing plague was a warning from history itself, a moment in which the accumulated pressures of famine, disease, stress, and fear coalesced into a force that no single human could resist. Others suggested that it was a glimpse of human physiology pushed beyond its natural limits, revealing hidden capacities for endurance, pain, and involuntary movement. What is certain is that the people of Strasbourg remembered. Their children, grandchildren, and subsequent generations told the story, often embellishing it, sometimes mythologizing it, but never forgetting the terror, the wonder, and the incomprehensible rhythm of those weeks. The streets where it happened were considered cursed, not by any supernatural entity, but by memory itself. Any stranger who wandered into the city and heard the stories would shiver at the thought of being caught in a movement that could not be stopped, a compulsion that could not be resisted. Even centuries later, historians studying the event describe it as one of the most remarkable intersections of biology, psychology, and social behavior ever recorded. It remains a profound lesson in human vulnerability and resilience, a chilling reminder that under the weight of fear, hunger, and unseen forces, humans can act in ways both extraordinary and terrifying. The dancing plague of Strasbourg, 1518, is remembered not only for its strangeness, but for the testament it leaves about the fragility and endurance of the human body, the thin line between sanity and compulsion, and the haunting echo that such events leave in history and memory. As the months drew on, the surviving citizens of Strasbourg began to emerge from their homes. But the city they returned to was not the one they remembered. Streets were littered with debris, abandoned carts, broken tools, and the occasional personal belongings left behind by those who had danced themselves into death. The air carried the faint, almost imperceptible scent of decay, not only of bodies but of routines and lives interrupted. The rhythm of daily commerce, once so reliable, had been replaced by silence, punctuated only by the occasional shuffle of the living who moved with caution, haunted by the memory of motion that could overtake them without warning. Some survivors wandered aimlessly through the streets, their limbs trembling from weeks of nervous tension, their minds replaying the images of friends, family, and strangers dancing until exhaustion consumed them. Mothers whispered prayers over empty beds, fathers stared at vacant chairs, and children touched the walls as if seeking reassurance from stones that had witnessed their suffering. It was not just grief, they carried a profound sense of unease, a lingering compulsion that made them tremble at the sound of footsteps, at the beat of drums, even at the rustle of leaves. The body, once again under their control, still remembered the motion it had been forced to perform. In the following months, chroniclers began to write detailed accounts of what they had seen, often including graphic descriptions of the dancers, exhaustion, their injuries, and the eerie synchronization of movement. They documented individuals who had danced for days without pause, some still able to recall conversations mid-step, others speaking incoherently while their feet continued without rest. One chronicler wrote of a man who had danced for nearly 3 weeks without sleep, his face gaunt, his eyes hollow, who later claimed he could still feel the rhythm of the city beneath his feet, even after returning home. These accounts became the foundation for centuries of study, blending folklore, medical observation, and philosophical reflection. The medical community struggled to understand the phenomenon. Physicians attempted to rehabilitate survivors physically, tending to swollen joints, blisters, and broken bones. Some survivors had permanent damage. Their muscles and ligaments could no longer support the same level of activity. Others displayed psychological effects, tremors, recurring hallucinations of movement, sudden anxiety attacks, and chronic insomnia. Entire families reported that at night, children would rise from sleep and dance unconsciously for a few minutes before awakening in terror, often unable to explain their behavior. The dancing plague left not only physical scars, but an indelible mark on the human psyche, demonstrating that trauma could endure long after the body had recovered. Religious authorities attempted to interpret the plague as divine judgment or a test of faith. Some survivors devoted themselves to extreme piety, convinced that their endurance had spared their souls. Others rejected religion entirely, unable to reconcile their suffering with any moral framework. Churches became both sanctuaries and symbols of powerlessness, places where people prayed for understanding, guidance, and forgiveness, while aware that the divine had either permitted or orchestrated the compulsion in ways beyond human comprehension. Strasbourg itself slowly recovered over decades. Streets were rebuilt, markets reopened, and new generations populated the city. Yet the memory of the dancing plague remained ever present. Buildings where the first outbreaks had occurred were avoided, often left vacant or repurposed carefully. Families recounted stories of the event to their children, emphasizing both caution and the fragility of human control. Travelers were warned about the history of the city, and chroniclers preserved extensive records in hopes that future generations would learn from the terrifying lesson of human vulnerability. The legacy of the dancing plague extended far beyond Strasbourg. Reports of similar episodes appeared sporadically across Europe, though none matched the scale of the 1518 event. Historians studied these incidents, attempting to find patterns of stress, famine, ergot contamination, or social hysteria. The Strasbourg plague, however, remained unique in its endurance, its scale, and the profound human suffering it inflicted. It became a symbol of the fragility of societal order and the incomprehensible ways in which collective phenomena could manifest, often defying the understanding of contemporaries and leaving lasting psychological and cultural scars. Even centuries later, modern scholars continue to examine the dancing plague, fascinated by the interplay of biology, psychology, and social influence. The event is cited in studies of mass hysteria, neurological compulsion, and collective behavior, and is often invoked in discussions of human vulnerability under extreme stress. It is remembered not merely as an oddity of history, but as a powerful lesson in the limits of human control, the endurance of the body under duress, and the haunting persistence of memory in shaping both individual and collective consciousness. The story of Strasbourg's dancing plague leaves an uneasy question: how much of human action is under conscious control, and how much can be overtaken by unseen forces, whether biological, psychological, or social? Survivors described sensations of being both observer and participant, of mind and body moving at odds, and of an invisible rhythm that persisted long after the immediate crisis had ended. Even today, imagining the cobblestone streets alive with relentless, synchronized movement evokes a haunting vision of human fragility, endurance, and the unpredictable nature of collective phenomena. Survivors often recalled days filled with a strange duality, terror and normality intertwined. In the early mornings, mothers would step outside to fetch water, only to freeze in horror as their children, already awake, began moving uncontrollably. Fathers tried to intervene, dragging family members back into homes, yet the compulsion was stronger than physical restraint. Shoes would wear through within hours, feet blistered and bled, yet the movement persisted. Some people described a strange dissociation, as if their mind were separate from their body, watching in disbelief while legs and arms obeyed some invisible rhythm. Sleep was rare, broken by the sound of distant drums or the shuffle of feet echoing across stone streets. Those who rested too long would often awaken, heart racing, feeling the motion returning as if it had never stopped. Daily life in the city became a constant negotiation between survival and avoidance. Food was scarce, not only because markets were empty, but because families could not consistently feed themselves without risking exposure to the compulsive movement in the streets. Many abandoned households were looted or scavenged by those driven to movement, turning survival into a grotesque form of competition. Clothing and bedding were ripped or left behind in the chaos. Homes were strewn with the remnants of interrupted lives. Even as people tried to maintain some semblance of routine, the streets called to them. Ordinary tasks, fetching water, tending livestock, collecting firewood, became acts of extraordinary risk. Any exposure to the streets, even briefly, could draw someone into the unstoppable rhythm. The social order that had once governed Strasbourg collapsed. Civic leaders were powerless. Courts could not function. Soldiers and watchmen abandoned their posts. Priests tried to maintain authority, but their influence diminished as the compulsion spread. People observed each other with fear, suspicion, and helplessness. Communities fragmented. Trust eroded. Even family units, normally sources of stability, were torn apart as individuals were forced into the streets. Some who resisted the compulsion became isolated, hiding in attics, cellars, or hidden rooms. Others could not resist and stepped outside, sometimes dragging others with them. The city became a chaotic choreography of endurance, suffering, and human fragility. Children, particularly vulnerable, were tragically caught in the movement. Some were reported to rise from beds in the dead of night, feet shuffling across cold floors, hands twitching in the air, eyes wide and unfocused. Parents often witnessed their own children move uncontrollably, and some could do nothing to stop them. Chroniclers described these moments with a sense of profound horror. To watch one's own flesh betray the mind is a pain no tongue can convey. Older children sometimes led younger ones into the streets, inadvertently spreading the compulsion further. These details haunt historians even today, illustrating the indiscriminate nature of the event and its capacity to affect every age and social standing. Medical practitioners, though still observing, were stretched to their limits. They documented patterns, the onset of movement, escalation, exhaustion, and eventual collapse. Treatments were experimental and often brutal by modern standards. Physicians attempted to cool bodies with baths, offer herbal remedies to calm nerves, and even use physical restraint, though such measures were largely ineffective. Injuries accumulated, sprained ankles, broken bones, torn muscles, and infections from blisters and raw skin. Some dancers were forced to lie on makeshift beds for hours, yet as soon as they were left alone, they would rise and continue. The human body demonstrated both incredible resilience and horrifying vulnerability. Even those who survived uninjured were often traumatized for life. Religious interpretations varied. Some clergy saw it as divine punishment, a purifying trial sent by God to remind humanity of its fragility and sinfulness. Others feared it was a demonic test, a visitation intended to claim the souls of those unable to resist. Pilgrimages to the city increased, as people sought either to pray for deliverance or to witness the inexplicable phenomenon firsthand. Some visitors returned with symptoms themselves, suggesting that observation could trigger involuntary movement, hinting at a psychosomatic or socially contagious element. Strasbourg became both a place of fear and fascination, attracting curiosity while repelling ordinary life. The plague's aftermath continued for years. Survivors were marked in subtle ways, trembling at the sound of feet on stone, waking in the middle of the night with memories of relentless movement, or feeling an urge to step in rhythm with imagined drums. Families who had lost members often carried profound guilt. Neighborhoods that had once thrived were abandoned or slowly repopulated, their streets permanently scarred by the events. Chroniclers' accounts became part of European folklore, referenced in medical treatises, moral lessons, and later psychological studies. The event was remembered not as an anomaly alone, but as a vivid demonstration of the human body's fragility, endurance, and vulnerability to forces beyond comprehension. Historians today note that the dancing plague of Strasbourg offers insights into human psychology under extreme duress. It demonstrates how fear, stress, and social contagion can combine with physiological vulnerability to create a phenomenon that seems almost supernatural. It also illustrates the fragility of social order when conventional authority is undermined by forces that cannot be explained or controlled. The city, scarred both physically and psychologically, became a case study in resilience, endurance, and the horrifying ways in which ordinary life can unravel when individuals are subjected to overwhelming stress and compulsion. Even centuries later, imagining the cobblestone streets alive with movement, bodies in relentless motion, the cries of the exhausted, and the silence of those hiding indoors remains profoundly unsettling. Strasbourg's history carries an indelible lesson. Under certain conditions, humans are capable of unimaginable endurance and equally unimaginable suffering. Memory, storytelling, and documentation preserved the tragedy, ensuring that the haunting image of streets filled with involuntary dancers would never fade from history. The city recovered in structure, commerce, and governance, but the psychological and cultural imprint of the plague lingered, whispered through generations, and studied by scholars seeking to understand the interplay between body, mind, society, and compulsion. Some survivors' stories are particularly haunting. One woman, Anna, had watched her entire household succumb to the movement. Her husband had been the first to rise, his eyes blank, stepping forward as though drawn by a force beyond comprehension. She tried to restrain him, holding him back in the doorway of their home, but his feet would not obey her. Soon their children followed, moving like marionettes in a cruel performance. Anna described the experience as living in a nightmare while awake, seeing my family alive but not theirs anymore. She fled to a neighboring home, hiding in the attic for 3 days, listening to the footsteps and cries echoing below. When she finally emerged, the city was a shadow of itself, streets empty, except for the scattered, exhausted dancers, some lying prone, some still stepping unconsciously, their bodies broken but still moving. Another account comes from a young apprentice, Matthias, who had watched his master collapse after days of unceasing motion. Matthias tried to drag him to safety, only to feel the compulsion himself. He described his mind screaming, quote, 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 "Stop," yet his feet continuing. "It was as though the city had possessed me," he wrote. "I could see the world, hear the cries, smell the rot of exhaustion and spilled water and food. And still I stepped forward, compelled, watching my own body betray me." He eventually escaped by locking himself in a cellar, but even there he awoke at night, moving briefly in a trance, as if the memory of the streets had been imprinted in his body. Daily life during the height of the plague was a delicate balance between survival and avoidance. Water had to be fetched from wells, but stepping outside risked involuntary participation. Food rotted in abandoned markets, and households scavenged what they could from empty homes. Livestock, released from barns, mingled freely with the dancers, indifferent to human suffering. Fires burned unattended or went out entirely, leaving some homes cold, dark, and empty. People who had survived alone began forming fragile alliances with others, cautiously signaling across streets and rooftops to exchange supplies. Every interaction carried the risk of drawing one into the compulsive movement, making survival a matter of both careful observation and immense self-control. Social hierarchies crumbled completely. Nobles fled to estates outside the city, abandoning servants and tenants. Merchants lost their livelihoods. Artisans abandoned their workshops. Clergy maintained some semblance of authority in empty churches, but their influence was largely symbolic. Even law enforcement became irrelevant, as no amount of authority could counter the invisible rhythm compelling bodies to move. Those who resisted were often isolated, hiding in attics, cellars, or remote areas of the city. They watched friends and neighbors move involuntarily, powerless to intervene, and were forced to confront both fear and grief in isolation. Religious interpretations ran the gamut from divine punishment to demonic possession. Pilgrims arrived seeking to witness or pray, sometimes contracting the compulsion themselves. Priests attempted ritual cleansings, processions, and prayers, but results were inconsistent at best. Some dancers would fall briefly at the sight of a relic, only to rise again moments later. Others seemed unaffected by holy interventions entirely. Clergy debated endlessly, writing treatises that combined theology with observation, attempting to reconcile the physical and psychological reality of the plague with spiritual understanding. Medical practitioners documented every detail they could, noting patterns in onset, escalation, and eventual collapse. They observed injuries from prolonged movement, blisters, torn ligaments, sprained ankles, fractured bones. Yet even the injured continued moving, sometimes with extraordinary coordination, sometimes in convulsive jerks. Sleep deprivation was universal. Exhaustion became chronic. Some dancers experienced hallucinations, seeing visions or hearing voices that seemed to guide their movements. Others remained lucid, able to respond verbally while their bodies moved beyond conscious control. Physicians of the era experimented with herbal remedies, physical restraint, baths, and food interventions. But nothing succeeded in stopping the compulsion. The psychological toll was immense. Survivors described a dual reality, one part aware, observing the horror, and one part trapped, obeying a force beyond control. Nightmares were common. Children who had danced unconsciously in their sleep woke screaming, reliving the movements they could not resist. Adults trembled at the sound of footsteps on stone, unable to distinguish reality from memory. Families who survived often felt guilt over those lost, unsure whether their own endurance had come at a cost to others. Even after the plague faded, its shadow lingered. Streets were slowly cleared of debris. Markets reopened. Families repopulated homes. Yet the memory of movement haunted the city. Buildings where the first outbreaks began were considered cursed. Stories were passed down for generations, becoming part of local folklore. Scholars studied the event, analyzing patterns, hypothesizing causes, and attempting to understand the interplay between biology, psychology, and social behavior. The plague became a symbol of the fragility of human control, the endurance of the body, and the unpredictable power of collective phenomena. Strasbourg itself recovered physically over decades, but the emotional and cultural scars persisted. Survivors often became reclusive or obsessively cautious. Children were raised with constant warnings, teaching them the story of how the city had been overtaken by an invisible rhythm. Chroniclers' accounts were preserved, copied, and studied, forming the foundation for centuries of medical, psychological, and sociological research. Visitors were warned of the streets where the dance began, where lives had been lost to compulsion, and where memory itself seemed to hold a rhythm that could haunt the unwary. The dancing plague of Strasbourg remains one of the most remarkable events in human history, a testament to the fragility and endurance of the human body, the vulnerability of the mind under extreme stress, and the power of social and psychological contagion. It is remembered not as a simple disease, nor a mere oddity, but as a profound demonstration of how ordinary life can unravel in the face of forces beyond comprehension, leaving lasting psychological, cultural, and historical echoes. As the compulsion raged, the city's rhythm became relentless, almost mechanical. Survivors reported hearing a persistent heartbeat in the streets, not from drums or music, but from the thousands of feet striking stone. The sound reverberated in every alley and square, echoing off the walls, reaching into homes and penetrating attics where the terrified tried to hide. One witness, a baker named Elise, described peeking through a shutter and seeing the street alive with people moving in waves. "It was as though the city itself had come alive," she wrote. "Their bodies were my neighbors, my friends, my kin, and yet I could not reach them, could not stop them, could not even understand what they were doing. And still they moved, endlessly, as though the world depended on it." For those trapped inside homes, life became a series of careful calculations. Water had to be carried from wells with extreme caution. Any exposure to doors, stairways, or streets risked involuntary participation. Windows were nailed shut, furniture barricaded, and families huddled together in silence, afraid that even whispering could summon the compulsion. Some reported that simply hearing footsteps, anywhere, was enough to ignite movement in their own bodies. Parents tried desperately to shield children, but many succumbed despite restraints, dragged by invisible rhythms or the sight of others moving in the streets. Hunger became a chronic companion, food rotted untouched on counters, and water had to be rationed carefully. Every act of survival carried the risk of crossing the invisible threshold into compulsion. Those who had been forced to dance for weeks suffered horrific injuries. Chroniclers recorded blisters so deep that the skin peeled away, joints swollen and immobile, muscles torn and bones broken. Some dancers tripped, fell into fountains or rivers, and were carried by the current while still moving. Others collapsed in corners, exhausted beyond measure, only to rise again moments later. Physicians observed hallucinations, delirium, and convulsive movements that sometimes resembled coordinated choreography. One doctor noted a man who, though delirious and bleeding from blisters, still managed to follow the rhythm of the streets perfectly, as though his body remembered the pattern even when his mind was failing. Social order disintegrated completely. Merchants abandoned trade. Craftsmen left workshops unfinished. Nobles fled estates, leaving servants and tenants behind. Clergy tried to maintain rituals in empty churches, but their sermons went unheard. Families fragmented. Friends disappeared, and communities fell into isolation. Those who resisted the compulsion became ghostly observers, hiding in attics, cellars, or roofs, watching friends and neighbors move like automatons, powerless to intervene. Fear and despair became contagious, spreading even among those untouched by the physical movement. Children were especially vulnerable. They rose from beds in the dead of night, stepping and twirling uncontrollably, their eyes glazed and unseeing. Parents who tried to restrain them were sometimes dragged along, unable to resist the compulsion themselves. Chroniclers noted that the movement seemed to spread socially as much as physically. Witnessing others dance could trigger the compulsion, creating waves of motion that traveled through streets and neighborhoods. Families were torn apart, with parents and children moving in opposite directions, some disappearing entirely into the endless rhythm of the city. Medical and religious interventions were largely ineffective. Priests attempted blessings, processions, and the sprinkling of holy water. Some dancers would briefly pause, kneeling or falling in apparent reverence, only to rise moments later and continue. Physicians tried herbal remedies, baths, physical restraint, and even forced feeding. Some claimed partial success, but most interventions failed entirely. The compulsion was stronger than any human effort, a force that transcended faith, medicine, and reason. Survivors' accounts describe a surreal duality. They were fully aware of their surroundings, fully conscious of the horror unfolding, yet unable to control their own movements. One man wrote, "I watched my neighbor collapse, bleeding, and I could do nothing but step forward, my mind screaming, my body obeying another law." Nightmares plagued those who survived, dreams of endless streets, shuffling feet, and rhythmic pounding that would not stop. Some reported waking in the middle of the night, moving unconsciously, only realizing after minutes or hours that they were stepping in a trance. The city itself bore witness to the tragedy. Buildings remained standing, but empty. Streets were scarred with footprints, trampled gardens, overturned carts, and abandoned belongings. The market squares, once lively with trade, became stages for endurance and horror. Water fountains were clogged with debris. Animals roamed freely, grazing among the dancers, indifferent to the suffering around them. Even when the compulsion ceased in some, the memory remained etched into the city's stones, its architecture, and the psyche of its survivors. Over time, the plague began to wane, not through intervention, but exhaustion. Bodies that could not endure collapsed permanently. Others, finally free of energy, lay motionless. The streets, once alive with unstoppable movement, gradually emptied. Yet the psychological and emotional imprint persisted. Survivors struggled to sleep. Children shivered at the sound of footsteps. Adults avoided crowded areas. Families mourned multiple losses, and neighborhoods that had once thrived became ghostly, empty, and silent. Strasbourg slowly rebuilt itself physically, but the city's collective memory ensured that the dancing plague would never fade from consciousness. Stories were passed down, chronicled in letters, diaries, and official accounts. Scholars, physicians, and theologians studied these records, debating causes, effects, and lessons. Some attributed it to disease, ergot poisoning, or neurological contagion. Others suggested mass hysteria amplified by fear, famine, and social stress. None could fully explain the compulsion's scale, endurance, and social transmission. Even centuries later, imagining the streets filled with dancing bodies, the exhausted groans, and the rhythmic pounding of feet evokes a haunting vision. Strasbourg became a cautionary tale of human vulnerability, endurance, and fragility. Memory, storytelling, and historical record preserved the event, allowing generations to reflect on the limits of the human body, the mind's susceptibility to compulsion, and society's fragility under extreme stress. Some survivors remembered the compulsion in almost cinematic detail. A man named Johannes wrote in his journal about stepping outside to fetch water, only to feel his feet rise before his mind gave permission. "I could see my neighbors in the square," he wrote, "their faces pale, their eyes blank, and I knew with certainty I would join them, whether I wanted to or not. My hands clenched the bucket, but my legs obeyed another law. I shouted, I cursed, I tried to stop, but it was no use. My body had its own rhythm, and I could not resist." Others recounted the haunting persistence of the compulsion. A young girl, Katerina, remembered being dragged by older children into the streets. She described her experience as walking in a dream, yet knowing I was awake. "I felt the cobblestones beneath my feet, the wind on my face, the shouts of others, but I could not stop. My limbs moved as though I were two people at once, one trapped, one observing." Families were torn apart in this way, often permanently. Parents would hide in attics while children wandered the streets. Siblings inadvertently separated, some falling permanently ill, others never returning. The rhythm of the city became almost unbearable for those who resisted. Survivors described the relentless beat of thousands of feet as a form of psychological torture. Even brief exposure to the sound could trigger involuntary motion, creating waves of movement that swept through homes and neighborhoods. Chroniclers noted that the phenomenon spread socially as well as physically. Witnessing others dancing often compelled the observer to join, whether adult or child. Social cohesion disintegrated, replaced by fear, isolation, and helpless observation. Daily life for those who survived became a careful dance of avoidance. Water had to be collected without exposure. Food had to be rationed and scavenged from abandoned homes. Some people developed secret signals, quietly communicating across streets or rooftops to exchange supplies. Others refused to move at all, hiding in attics or cellars for days or weeks. Every action carried the risk of involuntary participation. Exhaustion, hunger, and fear created a society governed not by laws or authority, but by survival, observation, and the desperate hope of remaining unclaimed by the compulsion. Medical practitioners remained observers, documenting injuries and patterns. Blisters, torn muscles, sprained joints, fractured bones. These were common. Some dancers collapsed and remained motionless, only to rise again moments later. Physicians experimented with herbal remedies, baths, food interventions, and even physical restraint, but no method consistently halted the movement. Some dancers displayed hallucinations or convulsive motions resembling choreographed movement, while others retained cognitive awareness, speaking coherently while their bodies continued in defiance of will. Religious interpretations were wide-ranging. Some clergy claimed it was divine punishment for sins, others feared demonic influence. Pilgrims traveled to Strasbourg, hoping either to witness the phenomenon or to pray for deliverance. Some contracted the compulsion themselves, suggesting a psychosomatic or socially contagious element. The city became a place of fascination and terror, attracting curiosity while repelling ordinary life. Children were particularly vulnerable. They would rise from beds in the middle of the night, stepping and twirling unconsciously. Parents often became participants themselves, dragged into the streets by their offspring. Chroniclers noted that movement spread socially. Seeing others dance often triggered compulsion, creating waves of motion traveling across neighborhoods. Entire families were separated. Some members lost permanently, others returned changed, exhausted, or psychologically scarred. Eventually, the relentless rhythm that had consumed Strasbourg began to fade, not with triumph, but with exhaustion. The streets, once alive with ceaseless motion, grew quieter. Some dancers collapsed permanently, their bodies spent beyond recovery. Others, after days or weeks of unceasing movement, found their limbs finally obeying their minds again. The compulsion, which had seemed unstoppable and eternal, receded like a tide, leaving behind a city scarred in both stone and spirit. Survivors emerged, trembling and haunted, their bodies aching from months of overuse, their minds burdened with memories no one should endure. Parents searched for lost children, often finding only empty rooms or the remains of those who had danced themselves to death. Families tried to reunite, but many were incomplete, forever altered by the invisible force that had overtaken their city. Those who had resisted the compulsion carried their own traumas, nights haunted by footsteps, sudden urges to move, and vivid memories of friends, neighbors, and loved ones moving uncontrollably. Strasbourg itself was a shadow of its former self. Streets were littered with debris from abandoned homes, overturned carts, and trampled gardens. Buildings stood empty, their walls silent witnesses to the months of horror. Markets and workshops lay dormant, their owners gone, their tools abandoned. Fires had destroyed some neighborhoods, while others were left cold and silent. The city had physically survived, but socially and emotionally, it was a husk. In the years that followed, the survivors adapted as best they could. Some moved away, seeking to escape the memories, while others remained, determined to rebuild. Communities slowly reformed, markets reopened, homes were repaired. Life returned, but always under the shadow of what had occurred. The psychological scars endured: anxiety, insomnia, nightmares, tremors, and sudden, involuntary movements haunted those who had lived through the plague. Children who survived were raised with stories of caution, warnings whispered across generations to ensure that the city's history was never forgotten. Theological and medical interpretations emerged, attempting to explain the inexplicable. Priests described divine punishment, demonic influence, or moral tests. Physicians recorded symptoms and patterns, hypothesizing mass hysteria, ergotism from contaminated rye, or a combination of biological, psychological, and social factors. None could fully account for the scale, duration, or intensity of the compulsion, yet chroniclers documented every detail, from individual struggles to the collapse of societal order, preserving the event for posterity. Strasbourg became a city marked by memory. Buildings where the dancing had begun were avoided or repurposed. Streets retained the imprint of feet, both physically and in the minds of those who walked them. Stories passed down through generations kept the event alive, blending fact with legend. Scholars, historians, and psychologists would study the plague for centuries, fascinated by the interplay of body, mind, and society under extreme duress. The city's ordeal became a cautionary tale, a reminder of how quickly ordinary life can unravel when invisible forces, biological, psychological, or social, intervene. Even today, the Dancing Plague of Strasbourg is remembered not simply as an oddity of history, but as a profound lesson in human vulnerability. It demonstrates the extraordinary endurance of the human body, the fragility of the mind under duress, and the thin line between order and chaos in society. It is a story of suffering, endurance, grief, and resilience, a haunting narrative that echoes across centuries. The streets may now bustle with life, commerce, and laughter, but the memory of what occurred remains, etched into the city's stones, whispered through stories, and preserved in the annals of human history. The final lesson of Strasbourg is both chilling and humbling. The human body can be compelled beyond reason, the mind can be powerless to stop it, and society can crumble under forces that cannot be seen. Yet, amid devastation, life persists. Survivors rebuilt, communities reformed, and stories endured. The Dancing Plague left behind not just loss, but also a testament to resilience, memory, and the enduring mystery of human nature. A story of tragedy and endurance that continues to captivate and warn all who hear it. The city recovered, but the rhythm never truly left its streets. In the echo of footsteps, in the memory of lost lives, in the stories passed from parent to child, the invisible dance persists. A reminder that history is never just past. It lives on in memory, in caution, and in the fragile endurance of the human spirit. Before we dive into today's tale, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss another story from the shadows of history. Also, we want to know where and when you're watching this video. Leave it in the comments below. Is it a quiet night or a busy morning? Let us know and become part of the story. Now, step carefully and join us as we journey into the terrifying streets of Strasbourg in 1518, where the city itself seemed to dance without mercy.